Hi there. In this lecture we see Joseph Henry Blackburne against Emanuel Lasker in round 5 of their match in 1892. So d4 from Blackburne, we have d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, b6. So a kind of Tartakower variation, which does result quite often in hanging pawns. So we see bishop e7, e3, bishop b7, rook c1, a6, and white volunteers the dark square bishop. This can be okay, but it does require a certain kind of follow-up and strategy, because black quite often aims for a very dynamic pawn structure now with the hanging pawns. So c takes, e takes, queen b3. We see black castling, bishop e2, queen d6, white castles, knight bd7, rook fd1, rook fe8, knight a4, trying to dissuade c5, and this bishop can be potentially hanging. So actually it's protected. Black wants to play c5 to open up the bishops. It looks like a very logical structure to head for here, to make use of. Even if, you know, d takes, b takes, we have basically two extended, like isolated pawns, but the adjacent files and the piece activity will make it worth it. And quite often there's a liberating move d4 in a hanging pawn structure from the hanging pawn's owner perspective to create tactics along this key diagonal, not that one, this one. So c5 with later d4. So the hanging pawn structure is headed for, after knight e1 we have c5. Black's already doing really quite well. We have queen a3, bishop e7, d takes, b takes. So here we are with the hanging pawns. You can see that these two pawns are like an extended form of isolated pawn. Black has the bishop pair. We have bishop f3, queen e6, and now queen d3. This is a bit of a mistake here. It seems as though the c5 point is one of black's weaknesses, which white should try and celebrate with queen c3. So for example, bishop c6, b3. If d4 here, this situation should be about equal. You know, this position, it's interesting. You know, white's moves need to be quite precise sometimes, so that looks at the bishop, and white can be annoying. It should be an even position, but queen d3 allows knight e5, and this is very scary now for white. We have queen d2, knight takes f3, check, knight takes f3. Okay, so c5 is under fire, that's protected. Now here, it seems there's a critical moment where black is encouraged to play d4 because white retreats the knight to c3. This is like a thematic move with this pawn structure. Especially here, it can cause a lot of damage. Better would have been queen a5, hanging around the c5 kind of Achilles heel of this structure, and you know, trying to dissuade d4. And if bishop d8, just hang around looking at c5 still, bishop e7 hang around, and if d4 here to test it, there's queen b6 if nothing else, hitting the queen and hitting the bishop. This would neutralize, with good play, it should neutralize black's initiative getting the queens off. Black wants to play for some, you know, pressure on the king side. This will be about equal. And if we look at bishop c6, if black didn't want the exchange of queens, this position, you know, white has resources like this, and it ends up being okay for white. White can actually stabilize, it seems. So, but this wasn't played. Knight c3 just runs into a thematic move, d4. Players with black want to play this to liberate, you know, the light square bishop along the diagonal. E takes, and it's cashed out now for structural damage of white's position. Check. Queen h5. So looking at f3 now. We have rook g1. Yeah, this is an unpleasant position, to say the least. And there's also a very unpleasant idea of bishop g5. And then, you know, if f4, queen f3 check, and then bishop takes, skewing along the diagonal. So there are concerns here, a couple of concerns at least. We have rook g1. Okay, that stops bishop g5. if d takes c5, in fact, a very precise way of playing it, forget bishop g5, there's actually even queen takes f3 check and rook c6. This rook lift is very dangerous. And if knight e2, bishop takes c5, and actually white is getting crushed tactically here after rook d6, there's an overload. Can you see what black would play here as an example for 100 points? Black to play here. Yeah, check or checks, even the outrageous ones. Bishop takes f2 check for rook takes d1, and this is just winning the exchange as well as being a pawn up. So it's a dangerous scenario. So rook g1 was played, queen takes f3 check, rook g2, bishop f6, and now d5. So you might ask, what about d takes? Again, you know, this is scary, this rook takes c5. This kind of scenario, there are possibilities here introduced, such as bishop g5 again. If queen d1, queen c6, keeping the pin on g2, and this kind of situation is very nice for black. There's a nice c-file pin and great pressure here. Black overall is looking great here, very comfortable. So anyway, d5 is played. Rook cd8, queen d1, queen goes to f5. Queen f4 might be a little bit more precise, it seems, tying down the white queen a bit more because of that c1. If queen c2, for example, g6, and here, you know, white loses the center pawn. So that's an example. Here's another, you know, rook c2, bishop d4, g6, and here black is also doing great. There are great possibilities of at some point taking out d5 first with bishop takes c3. So anyway, queen f5 though was played, queen b3, g6, rook d1, rook b8, queen a4, rook e d8. So looking at taking out d5. It turns out here bishop takes c3 was interesting for rook e5. This is a very interesting position. For example, here there's rook b4, and you know it gets scary, you know, taking out c4 there. But there's other dynamic possibilities going on here. So it's just in black's favour. If queen at a3 taking out here, this position, rook d4 as an example, and you can see that the back row is vulnerable. You know, check and check there if rook takes. You know, this is just an advantage for black. So, okay, we have rook ed8, queen e4, queen h5, f3, and now rook b4 here, queen e2, king g7, rook g4, rook b7. Rook d4 was nice as well in this position, undermining things, undermining d5, potentially. So first bishop e5 though, and then, you know, taking out d5 pretty safely. So rook b7 though was played, d6, and now bishop d4, that disconnects that pawn. Rook d2, and the pawn is taken. So a nice pawn up. The bishop seems pretty good here as well. We have knight e4, rook e6 keeping a nice pin. Now knight g3, this is a tactical move of some sort, but it only serves to, it's a pretty diabolical position before knight g3. Black is in the driving seat clearly and has things like well, a lot of things brewing up, like doubling the rooks and maybe f5 later. There's a lot of things brewing up. So knight g3 is, you know, guess what black plays here, which is absolutely fine, and which serves to simplify the position in black's favour. So what would you play here with black for 200 points? Think about this position. What would you play here? So the queen is attacked. Yeah, we can actually play a desperado move tactic. Queen takes g4. So the queen's come off. You know, what else does white do? And then we win another pawn, 2 pawns up. Thanks very much. Transposition to a winning, absolutely winning endgame. This is just hopeless for white, this endgame. So the king comes up to the center. The bishop is actually dominating the knight here. If we look at this, it's dominating that knight. That's something to aim for. King d3, king d5, a4, a5, knight g3, and that's at a cost of horrible double pawns. f6, end of the game. Yes, white was very outplayed during this game, and it's a trivial matter to win this with the 2 extra pawns. For example, one way is just to munch the pawns here, and queen to pawn soon, much faster than white's going to do anything over here. So yes, a crushing game positionally. It seems as though Blackburne is being systematically outplayed positionally in the closed game, essentially. These are not open games, these are more accumulation of advantages. The only problem is Lasker is accumulating the advantages, not Blackburne. That's the key difference in this match, it seems. Okay, so yes, and a fine use of the hanging pawn structure, not being too concerned. It does have dynamic perks, which were expressed very well in this game with the thematic d4. So Lasker is a real expert in the various pawn structures and doesn't mind the dynamic structures like future world champions like Fischer often played with isolated queen's pawn and hanging pawns actually on occasion. So it's nothing really to fear. It does have its perks. Okay, hope you enjoyed that. Thanks so much.